the camera on or anything. It's working well. So, all right. I was just looking at my audio recorder. The last recording I went to do on this, I noticed that it didn't record it all, and so now I see it says the card's full. So much for doing that. Something else I got to do. So, okay. All right. Well, welcome tonight, our East Knox Women's Bible Study group. It helped I get on the right lesson. I'm just really with it tonight. Can you tell?
You're abundant.
Oh, wild and crazy. The lesson for this week and next week, did you notice how much shorter your lesson was?
Yes.
Did you get done a lot quicker? Did you still put it off to the last minute? Oh, we got one that's on it from the beginning.
I studied yesterday.
Well, yesterday, Janet used to do it all our lesson on Sunday afternoon. So, as I was working on earlier, several weeks ago, when I was reading through the rest of John and kind of charting it out, and how many verses goes in this lesson, how much can we cover comfortably without rushing through it and sharing all we want to share about it. And you never know. When I start studying, I never know what I'm going to run into, what I'm going to find in these lessons. So this week and next week's are actually shorter. They really showed up for me when I'm printing the lessons off. But next week's is even shorter than this one. So you may get through it really quickly. But this particular incident that we're studying this week and next week's are two completely separate incidences that were too important to just be added on to one of the other lessons. I mean, I could have added the rest of chapter 11 on with the story of Lazarus, but I didn't want to have to cut out some of what we shared with Lazarus, and I didn't want to have to rush over this either, because this is a very important part of the story. I didn't want to just barely address this one. So we may or we may not get through this shorter lesson quicker. You know how that goes, famous last words. But as I started studying this closely, I was really glad I separated them, because I found some things that I think are important for us to know. They're not exactly in the verses. They don't exactly come from the verses, but it helps to know this background information. Helps it all to fit together better. By the way, I told you last week that I had read one commentary that outlined chapter 11 using the letter D. He had a D for everything. So I ran across that again this week. That was from Elmer Towns. And so he outlines this chapter 11 this way. He said that the attitude of the disciples toward death was doubt. The attitude of Martha toward death was disappointment. Mary's attitude was discouragement. Christ's attitude was deliverance. And then for this section of the chapter, he said the Jews' attitude toward Christ was destruction. So I thought that was really interesting how he did that. And so I just thought I'd throw that out. But before we get into the questions, let's look at the overview. So what was your impression on reading this straight through? I mean, when we think of John chapter 11, we automatically think of the raising of Lazarus. Did you know this was part of the story?
I didn't think about it coming close.
Yeah.
As you read that story and you read the next story at different times.
Yeah. Generally, if a pastor's preaching on it, or you've got it in a Sunday school lesson or whatever, they are divided out. And if you're not connecting them, you don't realize that. I mean, this is just the same day or two difference. Yeah. Anything else? What hit you about it? What'd you learn about it?
What struck me is just human nature. They just saw a miracle. They've seen miracles throughout, as we've been reading. And yet they still come back to how it's going to affect them in this world.
Yeah.
And the politics of it. Oh, well, if he's getting that, they're never seeing there, then we need to be aware of that, and it's just, you would think they would just fall down and say, oh, I can't believe this, aren't we?
We get to be here. We get to be alive. Yeah.
Instead, it's, okay, what does this mean for us?
Yeah. Yeah, human nature never changes, I guess. You and I live in an era where we can see prophecy being fulfilled before our very eyes, and we should just be totally in awe of the things that's falling into place. I've shared before that this woman that I follow some of her teachings says things aren't falling apart, they're falling into place. But yet we're more worried about what's falling apart than what's falling into place. So, anything else you want to share about reading this?
Well, I think the Pharisees changed their view. In the beginning of John, they didn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah. Mm-hmm. But after he resurrected Lazarus, they believed he was the Messiah. And that's why they were so opposed. I mean, they were opposed against him because he was saying, I'm the Son of God, mm-hmm. and all that. Mm-hmm. And they just didn't believe it. But now, they believe it, and he needs to be taken out.
Yeah. And that's the thing. Just like Don said, you would think if they believed that he was God, he was the anointed one, he was the Messiah, they'd be falling down at his feet. But oh no, he's going to rock the boat. He's going to mess up what we've got going. Yeah. Unbelievable.
A threat to power.
A threat to power. It's exactly right. Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but they threatened multiple times to arrest him. Is this the first time, though, that they've said they plan to kill him?
No, actually, all the way back in chapter 5, verse 18, it says, and the Jews sought to kill him. And if you remember, we stressed the continuous tense of those verbs. He was continually doing things on the Sabbath, and they were continually seeking to kill him. And what a surprise it was that came that early in his ministry. I mean, he hadn't even appointed the disciples yet, and they were already seeking to kill him. We're going to talk a little bit more about the attitudes of what it was then versus what it was now. The attitude of it has changed. They were against him then, but they are adamant now. But yeah, it was more sporadic. It was more incident driven then. Like they would be mad and want to do something, and then they'd get over it, kind of thing. And here, the whole atmosphere changes. So. Anything else? All right. As we finished up last time, we saw, we're going to step back and overlap last week to this week. As we finished up, we saw two reactions to this very public miracle of Jesus. And by the way, one writer said that he didn't think that this was intended to be a public miracle. And I'm like, who am I to disagree with a writer of a commentary? But I disagree. I think it was intended to be a very public miracle. Everything Jesus did here was intended to be public. True, he did speak to the sisters privately, but everything else he did was public. He arrived on the fourth day, right when everybody would be arriving. He told the disciples that what he was going to do, and he was going to do it so that they might believe. What he was going to do was going to be in front of them. Of course, everything else he'd done, a lot of the other miracles he'd done had been in front of them, so they might not have understood it as being public, but once it got there, it became a very public thing. When he went to the tomb, he prayed so everyone would hear what he said. And when he called loudly for Lazarus, it wasn't so Lazarus could hear him. It was so everybody else could hear him. If he had whispered, Lazarus would have still come out. But he knew... Here's the thing. Jesus knew that whatever he said, whatever happened here would get back to the Pharisees. And so I believe everything about this was done in public on purpose. So to overlap last week's lesson into this one, look again at the reaction to the miracle, verse 45. Many of the Jews who had come to Mary, and isn't that interesting? It doesn't say come to Martha. It came to Mary. We talked about Martha last week. She's that stoic, don't need anybody. They think Mary needs us. Martha won't have any sympathy for her. Mary needs us. So they came to Mary. And it said they beheld what he had done and believed in him. But, verse 46, some of them went away to the Pharisees and told them the things which he had done. I mean, I asked you the question, I said, shouldn't this have been the miracle to end all miracles? I mean, if there was going to be one cap it off miracle, this should have been it. True, Jesus had raised the dead before. We have two incidences of that. But both of them were up in the Galilean area, and both of them either within minutes or at least within hours of the person who had died. Here, it was someone who was dead for 4 days. As Elaine brought up, and as we said last week, the Jews believed that the spirit of the dead hovered around the corpse for 3 days. But after corruption, after decomposition began to take place, the spirit then left. So in the Jews' mind, there was no hope left. And also, not only that, but this took place in Bethany. Here in the south, in hollering distance of Jerusalem. Right in Jerusalem's back door. And not only that, but it involved an obviously very well-known and influential family. You telling me this is not going to go straight to the Pharisees? Of course it is. Just as quickly as it can get there. So if there ever was a miracle, a sign that would cause the Jews to believe that Jesus was who he said he was, this was it. But some of them went away to the Pharisees and told them the things which Jesus had done. This was not the first time somebody went and told the Jews. Remember the man in chapter 5, the man who'd been lame for 38 years. When the Jews confronted him carrying his pallet, he said, "Don't blame me. I don't know who did it. He told me to walk and he told me to pick up my pallet. And I picked up my pallet and walked. I don't know who it was." But then after Jesus found him in the temple and Jesus told him not to sin anymore, lest something worse befall him, what'd he do? He immediately went and told the Jews who it was that healed. And you remember, we said then that there, in different commentaries, there were differences of opinion as to why the man went to the Jews. Was it because he was just so excited at being healed and so excited that he finally knew who it was that he just had to go and tell the Jews who it was? Or was he cashing in his get-out-of-trouble-free card? I have my opinion on that. I believe he was just trying to get out of trouble, and so he went and told. But I bring that up here because I have not heard that with this scripture, but I did read it in one of the commentaries that there are those who teach something like that was happening here too. Some say that, well, these Jews who were there at this miracle were perplexed or they were confused about what was happening, as if you would say, I thought you said Jesus was a false Messiah. And here he is raising a dead man. What's going on here? And we kind of see that attitude in chapters 7 through 10, where we hear them say things like, he couldn't be the Messiah, could he? That kind of confused, perplexed attitude that they had. And so what they're saying is that that's the way that these felt. And they're like, I know, let's go ask the Pharisees. And that's why they went to the Pharisees. Others say that they went to the Pharisees because they were just so excited over what they'd seen take place that they just had to share it with the Pharisees. Yeah, right. I don't buy that. I don't know if you do either, but And it's definitely not how it reads here. I think it's clear what they did and why they did it. But there is something interesting to note here. It says specifically, they went to the Pharisees. Now, we've seen most of the time when John refers to religious leaders, he calls them what? The Jews. He just generically calls them the Jews. But on occasion, he does differentiate between the Pharisees and the chief priests. That just sort of hit me as I was studying again this morning, and I haven't taken the time to really dig through John. I didn't have time to go back and start another rabbit trail. But to dig through John and compare all the times when John uses the Jews versus when he differentiates who they are. But it appears, just in surface looking, it seems that anytime Jesus has a direct confrontation, now there are those where the Jews do this and the Jews do that, but when there is a direct personal confrontation, it was usually, and I won't say always because I haven't studied it that close, but at least most of the time, the direct confrontation comes between Jesus and the Pharisees, not the Sadducees and the chief priests. Why do you think that is? Just taking what you know about Pharisees and Sadducees, have you got any clue as to why you think that is? If you think back in Matthew's gospel, particularly, I think of Matthew because I've spent more time studying Matthew and John than the other two. But you think back in Matthew's gospel, particularly when he's up in the Galilean area and there are confrontations, it is Pharisees. Chief priests, Sadducees never come up to the Galilean area. It's always Pharisees up there. That much I remember. So what do you think? You got any clues? Any ideas?
Well, the Sadducees are political appointees. They're not religious at all.
Yes and no. The Sadducees were made up of, well, let's put it this way. Not all Sadducees are priests, but all the priests are Sadducees, I think, that is. So they're not political appointed. That's what they're, if you're a Levite, you're a priest. So it's not like all of them are religious or political appointed. The chief priest, the high priest, is at this point a political appointee, and we'll talk about that later. But that there's a clue to that, not only that they're not particularly appointed, but they are very politically motivated. So that is part of it. And being politically motivated, where would they keep themselves located mostly?
In their temple.
In their temple, in around their temple. That's pretty much where they would stay. So that's part of the reason. It is the Pharisees pretty much lived in and throughout all of Judea and Galilee. Of course, none of them were in Samaria, but in Judea and Galilee. There were Pharisees that lived throughout the area. But they were still Pharisees, and they were still considered to be separatists. And so the confrontations would take place. We see it, like I said, particularly in Matthew, we see it. But I begin to notice it here in John's Gospel too. There's another reason for that, and it goes right along with what you said. One of the reasons that most of his confrontations were with Pharisees is that the Pharisees were made up of more what you and I would call the common people. Now, yes, again, they were separatists. They separated themselves from other people, but socioeconomically speaking, they were among the common people. They were the middle class people. They were working people. In order to be a Pharisee, you had to be a tradesman of some sort. Remember what Paul did? What was Paul's trade? Tent maker. And he said he was a Pharisee of Pharisees. But they were what you and I would call you and me. Middle class, common everyday people. Again, separated because of their beliefs, but economically speaking, more on the level with the common people. The Sadducees and the chief priests, on the other hand, were the elites.
In their minds.
Yeah, well, not only in their minds, but they were the wealthy.
Because they were coddled
Yeah,
in the temple.
yeah, exactly.
It's like Congress.
Yeah, we're not going to go down that road. Although my mind went that way many times as I was working on this today. I'll be very careful there.
No, I said Congress. I didn't say
We're not going to go.
either party.
Right, exactly. I mean, that's exactly right. I thought about that as I read this. They were, we've talked before about when Jesus turned over the tables of the money changers, and we'll get into this later in John's Gospel when we get closer into those confrontations that take place in that last week of Jesus' life. We've talked about it a little bit here at Huckleberry, but the Sadducees, the chief priest, and Caiaphas in particular, the high priestly family, owned what you and I would call the franchise of the money changers and the selling of the temple sacrifices. Yeah. If you got to have temple money to pay the temple tax, and you've got Roman money, and you've got the denarius, and it's got to be changed into temple tax, you have no say over what the exchange rate is, and you can bet it's not in your favor. So yeah, they had become very, very wealthy because of that. So they were the upper class, they were the wealthy, they were the elite in their minds and in status as well. But here was another thing. The Pharisees were considered to be the teachers of the people. Remember Nicodemus, he said he wasn't a teacher, he was the teacher of the Jews. The Pharisees were responsible for the teaching. They had a great responsibility. Now, it had become out of kilter, but that was their responsibility. In all honesty, that was what they were supposed to do. They were actually responsible for what you and I, here it goes again, what you and I would call fact checking. I did not even think of that when I wrote that down. But they were responsible for that. They were responsible for checking any new teaching. Is this heresy or not? And so when someone had a question, yes, that's who they were supposed to go to. Who do you go to if you got a question? Remember the man born blind? We said his neighbors took him to the Pharisees. The whole reason they took him was, help us understand this. What's going on here? This Jesus that's supposed to be this really horrible false teacher, look what he's done. Surely, you're not saying he's not the Messiah, and you know what went with all of that. But that was their responsibility. They were the ones that they were supposed to take that too. So, in that sense, you could say, well, maybe they just took it to them because they really wanted to know, but no, that's not what's happening here.
Now, the Pharisees, and I know we talked about it, but they believed in the resurrection.
Yes, yes.
The Sadducees were just discounting the whole
Yeah,
thing.
that's why they were sad, you see.
That's how I remember.
Yeah, that's how we have to have these little things to help us remember this. Yeah, they didn't believe in the resurrection. And another thing is the Pharisees, as we were talking earlier, that there was no discounting what Jesus had done. The Pharisees believed there would be a Messiah. The Sadducees did not believe in a Messiah to come. So there again, you've got the opposites of this belief.
Well, did they not study the same Bible?
The Sadducees only believe in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Only the first 5 books. We were talking here Sunday, we were in that portion where the Sadducees, confront Jesus during Holy Week, and they give him that ridiculous story of this man, this woman was married to this brother and he died, and then she married the next brother and he died, the next brother, goes all the way down through the 7 brothers, and we'd be suspicious of the woman after it got down to about the 5th or 6th brother. But anyway, it goes through all of that, and they ask Jesus, so whose wife will she be in the resurrection? Well, they don't believe in a resurrection to start with. And I had always looked at that story as just a ridiculous story because they don't believe it to start with. But what they were doing was they were, you run into these people and they have one good argument. They don't believe in God or anything, but they've got one good argument, and they try to get you with that argument because they've got their answers to that argument every time. And so that was the one that the Sadducees had. They didn't believe in the resurrection. So how can you even suggest that there's a resurrection? Because this is ridiculous. And what Jesus says to them is, your problem is, it's not that you don't believe in the resurrection. Your problem you don't believe in God's power. And then he actually quotes from Exodus, a scripture that he says to them, have you not read? Of course they would have read, because it was in the portion of Scripture that they would read from. That God says, I am, present tense, continuous, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and Jacob. Not I was the God of them. They're dead and gone now. But I am, indicating that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are still living. So that's how he answered that question. But yeah, they didn't believe. They only believed the first 5 books of the Bible. And we just throw this out. If you're going to debate someone, you can't debate them with your answers. You got to take their answers and debate them where they are in order to deal with what they're trying to throw out at you. So, but anyway, back to this. So they take this to the Pharisees. And so it says, what was the result of the report? Look at verse 47. Therefore, the chief priests and the Pharisees convened a council and were saying, what are we doing? For this man is performing many signs. I mean, you read that. What are we doing? This man's performing many signs. Can't you see them wringing their hands? What are we going to do? What are we going to do about this man? He's performing all these signs. What are we going to do? Other translations may say, the New American Standard says he is performing all these signs. Your translation may say miracles, or may say attesting miracles. But the word here is the word Simeon, which means a sign. It's the word John always uses for miracles. Remember, he will say at the end of his gospel, he performed many other signs, but these have not been written or recorded. But these that have been written were recorded so that you might believe. There were signs that were done. These were signs. These weren't, the word miracle as it's used in the other gospels sometimes is dunamis, meaning a power. It was a wonder. It was a power that he did. But here, the specific reason that John records the ones he does is because they are signs. They're great miracles. Yes, people are raised from the dead. Great things happen. People are healed. But they're signs. They're signs to prove who he is. And it said they convened a council. And of course this refers to the gathering of the Sanhedrin, or at least part of it. And the reason I said what I did in your lesson, a council rather than the council, is that a lot of the commentaries made a big deal about the fact that it didn't say they convened the council. That would be the Sanhedrin. The council, of course, would refer to the entire Sanhedrin. And I didn't take the time to share all that about the Sanhedrin, but the Sanhedrin is made up of Pharisees and Sadducees. The majority of it is Sadducees, but the Pharisees, because of their connection with the common man, were a very influential minority. In other words, just because they were a minority didn't mean you could get things past them. But the way this reads, it seems to be that it is a more of an unofficial gathering. It's some of them, perhaps not the entire Sanhedrin, or at least they were meeting secretly. But now here's the thing that really struck me about this as I was reading it. Was there any discussion of whether Jesus was actually the Messiah or not? No. Not one time do they say, well, is he really? That doesn't even play into it. It reminded me, again, of what we're studying here in Matthew when the Pharisees are confronting Jesus during Holy Week, and they ask him all these questions, and why do you do this? Who do you think you are, kind of thing, turn over the money changers' tables and all that. And Jesus said, well, I'll answer your question if you'll answer my question. And he said, John the Baptist, was he sent by God or did he come from man? Well, the Pharisees, I'd say they called time out and they huddled and they discussed it. But what they didn't discuss was he called by God or was he called by man? What they discussed was, how are we going to answer this? Because if we say he was called by God, this will happen, just like you said. Or if we say he's called by man, this is going to happen. They looked at their options, and they couldn't determine the option. They couldn't determine which was best, so they just said, oh. And Jesus said, I'm not going to answer your question either. But it's the same thing here. They convene this council, but they don't even ask, is he really the Messiah? All they do is look at what he's done. And another thing, they never dispute that the signs are real. Nobody said, well, looked like Lazarus, but I'm not real sure it was. Now, there was no question of what Jesus actually did. They didn't say, what do we do if he is the Messiah? No, it was all about what's the ramifications. What if we say this? What's this going to do? If we say this, what's this going to do? You'd think that was their first order of business, but no, we got to get rid of it. Let's got to get rid of it. Yeah.
How does John know what's going on in this meeting? He wasn't there. Very
good point. And when we get up, talks about Jesus leaves, and so and we'll get to that in detail a little bit more. But one of two things: either his omniscience knows that they put out this edict to kill him. More likely is Nicodemus, or Nicodemus sent someone to tell him. If he just knew that they were going to kill him, that's one thing. But we have the details of the conversation. At any time, same way back in chapter 7, when the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the temple guard has come back and they can't arrest him. We have the details of the conversation. And we know then that Nicodemus spoke up somewhat and they shot him right down. So my opinion on that, and what seems logical, is that Nicodemus got word to him. I doubt Nicodemus went himself, but he got word to him. As the Pharisees had people there, some of them had, they would come back and tell Jesus. So what was it that they were so afraid of? Look at verse 48. If we let him go on like this, all men will believe in him. Let me see. Yeah, I'm going to read all that. All men will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. So, think about, we focus in on our place and our nation, but they said if we let him go on like this, go on like what? What are they referring to? Huh? If we let him keep healing people, now how stupid does that sound? If you're a Pharisee, you say, we can't let him keep healing people.
Well, mine says if we leave him alone. So that is.
Yeah, it's a little bit different look at it.
Yeah, just letting him go about his days, doing whatever he does, whatever miracle or Just
not only the healing, but the teaching and the sharing and the. Mm-hmm. If we let him go on like this, if we leave him alone, eventually everybody's going to come to believe in him. He was becoming more and more popular, and the religious leaders thought of. here's the thing. The religious leaders thought of Jesus as a man. Now, I'm with you. I believe that they knew who he was. I'm convinced that Caiaphas knew. Whether the others did or not, I'm convinced that Caiaphas did. But in addition to that, he was becoming more and more popular among the people. And they thought of him as a man, like any other man. And by that I mean, surely the time would come when he's going to make a move for power. I mean, that's what we would do if it was us, they were saying. We know, I know human nature, and if we leave him alone, next thing you know, he's going to be overthrowing things. He's going to be seeking power, and that's what they didn't want. I mean, isn't that what men do? They were essentially saying. That's what they would do if they got half a chance. And if Jesus caused a revolt, I thought about this, Rome would be on him like, as my mother used to say, like a duck on a June bug. I mean, Rome would be down there lickety-split. In fact, during Passover, when they finally arrest Jesus and they take him to Pilate, Pilate is there, if you can picture in your mind a layout of the temple complex. At the northwestern corner was the Antonia fortress, and that's where the Roman soldiers were garrisoned. During Passover, the prefect, or what the position that Pilate had, their headquarters was usually in Caesarea, down on the sea. But during Passover, they came to Jerusalem so that they could keep an eye on things. The Antonia fortress was taller than the temple building itself, and it was pretty tall, but it was taller so that they could look out from the garrison position and see the entire temple complex and could see what was going on. And remember, we're talking about millions of people that would be in Jerusalem for Passover. But they were in a position that they could keep an eye on what was going on. And so the Pharisees and Sadducees knew, first sign of a revolt, Rome is going to be on us. So both the Pharisees and the Sadducees wanted him out, but for different reasons. If Jesus really did usher in the kingdom of God, as both he and John the Baptist said, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. If he really did usher in the kingdom, and remember, the Pharisees would have known exactly what the kingdom was. Sadducees wouldn't have known so much about it because they don't read the other books of the Old Testament. But the Pharisees would have known all of those prophecies about what you and I know as the millennial reign. They knew all the prophecies about how Christ would reign, the Messiah would reign in David's place. He would actually be on the throne in David's place. They knew all those prophecies. So they knew they wanted Jesus out because they knew if he ushered in the kingdom, their position was gone. You don't need a teacher when the Messiah is sitting on the throne. The Sadducees, on the other hand, knew that they didn't believe in the Messiah, but they knew that if there was any sort of a revolt, they would lose their position because they ruled over temple business. That's how they made their money. The graft and the underhandedness and just the illegal things that they did. That's how they made their money. It was a very profitable business for them. When something affects either man's power or his pocketbook, now there's a problem.
It's interesting that they think that temple is theirs.
They do. Yeah, that is interesting.
Because it's the people's temple.
It's
not.
We could go down another road again there.
I know. I had a hard time on this lesson.
Yeah, me too.
Focus.
Yeah, I was telling Joe before we came, I said, let me just tell you what came to my mind as I'm reading this. Yeah, but you're exactly right, but it is my temple.
Right.
Yeah, and, we're making the money.
That's what the Bible says. It says our temple.
Oh, yeah? Let's say, well, of course, the translation I'm using says our place and our nation, but there was a a reference, I don't have my notes in front of me, to Acts chapter 6, I think, where they actually refer to the temple as our place. So yeah, that's exactly what was going through their minds. But the second part of verse 48, that the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation, our temple and our nation. You know, what little autonomy they had. Remember they told Jesus, oh, we've never been enslaved to anyone. Right. But they did have somewhat of autonomy, that they were able to go about their religion within bounds. It's kind of like I've heard A.W. Tozer, or read him, I haven't heard him, but I read A.W. Tozer talking about God's will being like a ship that, of course in his days there were no airplanes, but like a ship that would leave New York going toward England, and he said God's will is that the ship is going to England, but you have the free will to move around on that ship while it's going. And it's kind of that same way here. They were under control of the Romans, but they could move around on the ship as long as they stayed within certain bounds. And they didn't want to mess with those bounds. Yeah, and you know, here again, this was what I was thinking. I said, you know, I can't help but think of our current state of affairs in this country today. As long as bellies are full and the internet works, people's happy. You know, just I can close off everything else as long as my internet and my streaming services work, so I can escape. They're happy. Don't mess with my world is the attitude. But I'm afraid it's going to be messed with, but you know, that's another topic we won't get on. Another thing that struck me about this verse was what they said first. Look at that again. If we let him go on like this, all men will believe. And I thought about that. And I thought they gave the people, all men, they gave people too much credit. They really believed that if they let him go on about what he was doing, let him go on with his business, let him go on with what he was doing, if we leave him alone, everybody's going to believe. And I remembered back when the movie, The Passion of the Christ, came out. And I thought, everybody's going to believe now. Did they? No. The miniseries, the Bible, I mean, that was hyped, and it, you know, we hurried home. I believe came on Wednesday nights. We hurried home from church on Wednesday night from Bible study to get home in time to watch it. Everybody's going to believe, but they didn't.
Mine doesn't say believe; it says follow him.
Follow him now, but even at that. You're giving people way too much credit. Not everybody is going to follow. You may think they're crazy if they don't, but not everybody is going to do that. So many, in fact, I just saw a blurb of an ad this afternoon. There's a new movie about Noah coming out. Joe doesn't let me watch those movies because I sit and fuss at them. Or we've got this thing is we growl. Yeah. Many of them, though, are theologically sound. They're good programs. But not everybody's going to believe it. So I believe they gave people way too much credit for that.
Do you think they may have, because they persecuted him, do you think that Jesus gained followers because of that? That their attention that they gave to him, people would say, this is interesting, let me go check this guy out.
Maybe. I don't know, I hadn't really thought about that. What went through my mind initially, as you were saying that, was, and I can't remember the number right off the top of my head, the number of people that that he preached to in that period between the resurrection and the ascension. But then in Acts chapter 1, there was only 120 people meeting together. It may have caused some to look deeper. It may have caused some just to solidify what they believe. As far as I know, there is no nothing that says that happened, but it's quite possible. I mean, the more you look at something, the more you see things happening, it's going to cause you to examine it closer. And I think, particularly this raising of Lazarus, you'd think the disciples had been with him almost 3.5 years. I mean, they ought to believe. But he says to them, I'm doing this so you will believe, to solidify your belief. And even at that, we know what happened on that night, that they scattered. So it may have helped, though. But the religious leaders believed that the people would believe. And that's what really mattered. Not whether the people did or not. The leaders believed that they would believe. And that's what scared them. And what is interesting here is that by the time John actually writes this gospel, the temple has been destroyed. And it was destroyed by the Romans. And it was destroyed because of a revolt. But it had nothing to do with Jesus and nothing to do with Christians. But it was a revolt that caused it to be destroyed. So, any questions on that first part before we go on? Okay, so who spoke up? Verse 49. But a certain one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. You know, when I was little and it said Caiaphas was high priest that year, I thought that meant they took turns. I mean, that's what it sounds like. He was high priest that year. Somebody else was high priest the next year. They took turns. But what it actually means is that he was high priest the year that this all took place. The year that this happened, Caiaphas was the high priest. Now, God ordained the position, and we mentioned this briefly earlier, God ordained the position of high priest to be an inherited position. You go all the way back, this office of the priesthood is first mentioned in Exodus 28. And then on through Leviticus and Numbers, we get more and more detail as we go along. But this office of the high priest, the tribe of Levi, and there's a whole teaching we could go into on why the tribe of Levi, but the tribe of Levi, every person, if you were a male and you were born in the tribe of Levi, you were, first of all, you were a Levite. But if you happened to be from the line of Aaron, Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, the three children, if you were of the line of Aaron, you were a priest. You didn't have any choice of what your vocation in life would be. You were a priest. And all the rest of them from that tribe were the Levites, and it was their responsibility to work in and around the temple. So that's where that came from. They were appointed, but they were appointed by God in the very beginning. But this position of high priest, as I said, was to be an inherited position. It came first. It was to pass from father to firstborn son. Began with Aaron. It was to go to Aaron's firstborn son. Of course, those first two sons of Aaron brought that strange fire into the temple, and they were killed, and so it went to the next surviving firstborn son. And then it went to his firstborn son, and then his firstborn son, and his firstborn son, all the way down the line. That's where the high priesthood came from. All the others were priests, but that was the high priest. However, after the exile, and during the time of that intertestamental period, and especially by the time of the Maccabees, this office of high priest had deteriorated into nothing more than being a political position. It was appointed politically by that time. And by the time of Jesus' day, by the time Rome conquered Israel, it pretty much became like this political football that went to the highest bidder. Whoever could pay Rome the highest amount of money or to make it more politically advantageous to them, that's who got to be high priest. They could be related or not related. This Caiaphas, for instance, we'll see later in John's gospel that even though Caiaphas was the high priest that particular year, still it was his father-in-law Annas who was really the power behind the throne, so to speak. Annas was high priest, and I didn't write down the dates, but he was high priest for a period of time. It seems like 4 or 5 of his sons were high priests for periods of time. Caiaphas, who was his son-in-law, was high priest probably the longest period of time of any one of those. But what's really interesting about this, we'll see way later on down the line, that we see that there is a connection, there is a political connection between Caiaphas and Pilate. That is just so interesting. It's not said in Scripture, but if you read between the lines, you can see this connection. And the interesting thing is they were both deposed at the same time. Too much to be coincidence on that. But anyway, it was funny. One commentary said this. He said, like a mafia godfather, Annas sought to secure the office and ensure the family name and cash flow. So Annas was behind it all. In fact, this whole marketplace thing that went on with the buying and selling of animals and money exchange, the people refer to that as Annas Bazaar. Not, like a selling place, that word bazaar. Not bizarre like it's crazy, but it was. But anyway, Annas' Bazaar is what they referred to that as. So what did he say? Look at verses 49b and 50. He said to them, you know nothing at all. In other words, you idiots. Nor do you take into account that it is expedient for you that one man should die for the people and that the whole nation should not perish. Now, we already know what John's going to tell us in verses 51 and 52, but let's look at Caiaphas' words first. Was this really a prophecy? Yeah, sure, it was. Absolutely it was. Did Caiaphas mean it as a prophecy? No, of course not. But notice the rest of the Sanhedrin, or whether it was the full Sanhedrin or just those that were gathered here, they were concerned about what to do. They were concerned about how to properly do it. We said they were kind of wringing their hands. What are we going to do? But they were concerned about doing it in the right way. One thing about the Pharisees, they wanted it done right. They were not about going off the deep end. They wanted it done right, or at least some of them did. If you remember, we see them gathered like this before in chapter 7. And we'll look back at chapter 7, verses 40 through 52. This is after toward the end of the Feast of Tabernacles. Verse 40, some of the multitude believed when they heard Jesus' words. They're saying, surely this is the prophet. But others were saying, this is the Christ. And others were saying, surely the Christ is not going to come from Galilee. So there's all these differing opinions or ideas. And then they go on, and then some of them wanted to seize him, and no one could lay hands on him. Verse 44. Then 45. Then the officers, and we know that's the temple guard, the officers therefore came back to the chief priests and Pharisees. So we know either it's the full Sanhedrin, or at least some of them were meeting together, because it mentions both of them. And the officers the Pharisees and priests said to the officers, why did you not bring him? And the officers answered, never did a man speak the way this man speaks. And remember, the Pharisees are the ones to attack them. You're not led astray too, are you? And then Nicodemus, they say, you'll notice none of the Pharisees have believed in him, but you and I know that Nicodemus is there. And Nicodemus speaks up and says, our law does not judge a man unless it first hears from him and knows what he is doing, does it? Nicodemus wanted to do it by the law. At least let's do it the right way. I mean, if we're going to do this, at least let's do it the right way. Of course, they cut him off at the knees. You're not also from Galilee, are you? They just cut him down. But they wanted, at least some of the Pharisees, at least Nicodemus, wants to follow the law. They want to follow jurisprudence. They want to do it the right way of doing things. But, there in chapter 7, someone cuts him off, and then Caiaphas cuts him off, or whoever says it, in chapter 11. And he essentially says, "You idiots, we've got to kill him before he gets us all killed." That's essentially what he's saying. Caiaphas' words weren't exactly designed to win friends and influence people. You idiots. And that's essentially what he's saying there. You don't know what you're talking about. You know nothing at all, is the way that my translation puts that. So he wasn't kind and gentle in his language. He wasn't for, like I said, winning friends and influencing people. And this was comical. One writer said that Caiaphas' words, that Caiaphas and the way he spoke, he said it typified the kind of rude, boorish behavior that, according to the first century Jewish historian Josephus, characterized the Sadducees. In other words, all the Sadducees acted like this. We're the wealthy, we're the elite, we're the top of the line. You just don't have a clue. Wiles said, the behavior of the Sadducees one toward another is in some degree wild, and their conduct with those of their own party is as barbarous as they were to the strangers among them. But here's what's comical. He said, the commentary added, it should be remembered, however, that Josephus was a Pharisee and he was hardly an unbiased observer. He didn't like Caiaphas to start with, and so he didn't have anything good to say about him. But look at verses 51 and 52. John tells us why Caiaphas did this. He said, now this he did not say on his own initiative, but being high priest that year, the year that this was taking place, he prophesied that Jesus was going to die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but that he might also gather together into one the children of God who were scattered abroad. I mean, this was an actual prophecy. Verse 51 is an actual prophecy, and that's what really happened. So, first of all, how in the world can someone like Caiaphas speak an actual prophecy? God, exactly. If Balaam's donkey can turn around and speak to him, God, of course, it comes through God's words. God's words will override. This thought came to mind. Was in a meeting once. It was going to be a very contentious meeting. And I remember praying before I went in, God, please let the things that come out of the mouths of everyone be what you want it to be. God can overrule what comes out of our mouths. And he actually directed what would come out of Caiaphas' mouth. Another thing that we could say is, can a false teacher say something that is true? Absolutely. And that's where you have to be careful, because a lot of what a false teacher will say is true. So you have to be very careful. You can't just pick snippets here and there from someone. If you're going to follow a teacher, any teacher, when I find someone new online, you've got to watch a lot of their videos or listen to a lot of their teachings to know overall what it is they believe in a variety of different areas, because they can be very true and very, very good in some areas and be totally off the wall in other areas. I never forget this. A friend of mine once said to me, he was talking about this very well-known televangelist. If I said the name, you'd know exactly who he was. And he said, but he's so uplifting and so encouraging, and he sounds so good. And I said, even a blind hog can find an acorn once in a while. They can get a snippet right. They can say things that are very right. But here's another thing. It was actually thought in the Old Testament that the actual office of high priest brought with it the ability to prophesy. someone before, while the dad was the high priest and the firstborn son was not, he might not have the ability to prophesy, but once he became the high priest, then he had the ability. It came with the office, so to speak. Even if the man himself was not a very good man. And in other words, the position of high priest was blessed even if the man was not. And I often think about Eli and his scoundrel sons in 1 Samuel. I mean, those two sons were bad news. And Eli was a very weak man. He let them get away with what they did. But even in his position, even in his weakness, even in the things that he let happen that he shouldn't have, his position as high priest carried with it some power or some influence. The position was blessed. But Caiaphas said the very right words for the very wrong reasons. But then look at what John added in verse 52. He said, and not for the nation only, not for Israel only, but that he might also gather together into one the children of God that are scattered abroad. So who are these children of God who are scattered abroad? We are. Initially, it referred to the Jews who were scattered. The book of James, which is believed to be the first New Testament book written, somewhere around 44 AD, begins to the 12 tribes which are scattered. The 12 tribes would be Jews, and it refers to the Jews, the diaspora, the diaspora, however you want to pronounce it. But then, in 1 Peter 1, which was written about 20 years later, begins to the aliens who are scattered, who are the elect. And that clearly, you can read in Peter's letters, it clearly refers to Gentiles. And of course, as Paul would say, to the Jew first and then to the Greek or then to the Gentile. And John, writing when he did, would have seen the inclusion of many Gentiles at this point. So, okay, then what's the result of the meeting? Look at 53. So from that day on, they planned together to kill him. Other translations say they planned to put him to death. And this is what we were talking about earlier. This is different from chapter 5, verse 18, where it says the Jews sought to kill him. It's the same word for kill in both places, but there's more of a, in chapter 5, verse 18, and in the other places where they tried to stone him, it was more of a kill in any manner. However we need, let's just get rid of him, basically, is what it says in chapter 5, verse 18, and all those other times. They picked up stones many times, but that was sporadic. It was in anger. It wasn't planned out, we're going to go there and throw rocks at him. No, in anger, they grabbed up the stones to stone him. It wasn't thought out and planned out in advance. The Jews wanted to kill Jesus before, but it wasn't an actual plan in the works. It was what's a good word? It was a feeling. It was what they wanted to do. Now, how we're going to do it is something else entirely. But it was their attitude. It's how they felt toward him. They wanted to kill him. But now here, this is different. The King James Version, I believe, is the best in this. The King James Version says they took counsel to put him to death. Put him to death. Not just kill him. Put him to death. You see the difference in those two? The word, in the King James Version, the word put and the word death are the same word. It both means to kill. Anytime in Scripture, and we don't see it in our English languages, you got to look for it in a translation that uses the Greek numbers, and I don't read Greek, so I look for the numbers. I look when numbers are repeated or when numbers are different for the same word. I look and see what that's supposed to mean. But when you have two words that are the same Greek word, it intensifies the word. We would say superlatives, good, better, and best, or richer, deeper, deepest. That's how we intensify words. They intensified the words by repeating the word. Essentially, what this is literally saying is they were planning, they wanted to kill him to death. They had a plan. They were planning now not on just killing him, but on executing him. See the difference? This is what they're doing now. Now they're going to execute him. They have a plan in place.
One says they're plotting his death.
Oh, that's a good one. They're plotting his. Yeah, they were plotting it. Not just plotting to kill him here, there, wherever, but to execute. In actual set, they were going to arrest him and execute him. So what was Jesus' reaction to the meeting? Verse 54. Jesus, therefore, no longer continued to walk publicly among the Jews. And as we said earlier, how did he know about this? Well, could have been his omniscience in knowing that they were planning to execute him. But again, we have the details of the conversation. So I believe someone was there and related this. Either someone was there and related this to Jesus, or Jesus in his omniscience knew they were planning to execute him, and someone related the details of the conversation later to John. It could have happened either way. We don't know if Jesus knew the details of the conversation, but John did, at any rate. Some way, John had the details of the conversation. And we said before, Jesus would not die before his time, but he wouldn't be careless either. He just, why walk among them and you're just going to cause something to happen? Other people could get hurt. So he was not careless. So notice it says he didn't go back to Perea. He didn't go back to where he had been with the disciples earlier. He went to a place called Ephraim. He went away from there to into the country, near the wilderness, into a city called Ephraim, and there he stayed with the disciples. Now, scholars disagree on exactly where this is, but most of them believe that it's about 12 miles north of Jerusalem. Not quite in Samaria, but in the very outer edges of Judea, just no man's land, basically, between the two. We don't know exactly how long Jesus stayed there, or we don't know what he did while he was there. We do know, and I find this so fascinating, and then I look back and see how I've gotten stuff wrong in the past, but I find it so fascinating to put the Gospels together and to look at the timeline. Now, we know that there are about 3 months between the Feast of Dedication, that takes place around December-ish. It's winter, John told us. Hanukkah, as we know that time to be. The last time that Jesus was in Jerusalem, about 3 months between them and the Feast of Passover. We know Passover is determined on the new moon and then on the full moon of when it takes place. We know our Easter can be early in March, it can be late in April, so somewhere around that time frame would be the Passover. So somewhere around 3 months between the Feast of Dedication and the Feast of Passover that we'll see coming in the next verse. We know from Luke's Gospel that at some point during this time that Jesus was preaching or teaching and healing in Perea, and that he came from Perea to John. We know from John then that he came to Bethany to raise Lazarus. From what I've read and studied, it seems that here in verse 54, we're just a few weeks, maybe 4 to 6 weeks away from the Passover at this point, where we are right here. And from here, we know Jesus went to Ephraim. And then shortly before Passover, we know that he and his disciples returned to Galilee, because we know the women come with him when he's coming to the Passover. We know when he comes through Jericho just a few days before before what we would call Holy Week. So we can place that together because the women are with him. Scholars believe that he left Ephraim, went up into the edge of Galilee where they met up, and then came toward Jerusalem together. Many scholars believe that the events of Matthew 19 and 20, Mark 10 and Luke 18 and part of Luke 19 take place in that time frame between the time he's in Ephraim and the time that he comes back to Bethany again. That's what's taking place there. Some of the events, you'll remember these. Some of the events include Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse, where Jesus prophesies about end-time events. He talks about the days of Noah and the days of Lot, the things that's going to happen during the tribulation. It includes the stories, as I said a moment ago, of passing through Jericho, the stories of Zacchaeus, the stories of blind Bartimaeus. All of that takes place as Jesus is heading back to Bethany, where we will pick up again there in chapter 12. All these stories take place as we read in verse 55, now the Passover of the Jews was at hand. The story of Bartimaeus, the story of Zacchaeus, all that's taking place, as John says, the feast of Passover was at hand. They're nearing that place. So where are we now? A little bit before Passover. This is the third Passover of Jesus' ministry. He was in ministry a little while before that first Passover, so that's where we get our 3.5-year ministry span for Jesus. I've got a really cool book at home. It's the Chronology of Christ. And it looks at all the different theories, all the different scenarios of exactly when he was born and when he died, how long his ministry was. I like what this guy does. I can't remember the name of the writer, but what he does is he lays out all the different scenarios first, and then he tells you what he believes and why he believes it. And it just really helped me to get a clearer picture of when actually this is all taking place. It's around 33 AD is when this is taking place. But anyway, he's been in ministry 3.5 years. But why are they coming early? Look at 55b. Many went up to Jerusalem out of the country before the Passover to purify themselves. To purify themselves. They would go to Passover early to purify themselves. But it's really interesting to know what that means. A Jewish person had to be, and you already know this, they had to be ceremonially clean in order to participate in Passover. They had to be ceremonially clean to go into the synagogue or to go into the temple to do any of the sacrifices. Remember, the woman with the issue of blood had been ceremonially unclean for 12 years. Nobody could even touch her. I mean, you couldn't even get a hug. Couldn't be touched. The lepers couldn't be touched because they were ceremonially unclean. But if you were ceremonially unclean, you couldn't go in to the temple, and you for sure couldn't participate in Passover. One of the things, the most common defilement that a person made a person ceremonially unclean was if they had touched a dead person or been in a dead person's house or come in contact with someone else who had been in a dead person's house, whether they knew it or not. That's the clincher there. Or if they'd been in contact with a Gentile. I mean, you think of how did anybody ever be pure is what I want to know. I mean, you got all these things that made you impure, ceremonially unclean. So they were constantly trying to be ceremonially clean. So you can see that almost everyone coming into Jerusalem from a distance away would need this ritual cleansing, because they might have been in contact with somebody. I mean, who knows? Something else I found really interesting when we studied Matthew's gospel, and I remembered this, and I couldn't remember exactly where it was, so I went back and dug through our earlier study of Matthew, and it just so happens that that's going to come up this week in our lesson here. But generally speaking, cemeteries were located outside the city. Now, there were some private and some family tombs, like we saw with Lazarus, like we'll see with Joseph of Arimathea. But otherwise, if a person was found dead, remember they had to be buried the day they died. If a person was found dead, a lot of times they were just buried right there. They may or may not be buried in a cemetery as we would know it. Many times people were just buried along the side of the road. That's probably the reason the priest and the Levite in that story of the Good Samaritan, why they really didn't want to get close to that man, because if he was dead, they'd have to bury him. And if they touched him, then there you go. They're ceremonially defiled. So they passed by, as you know the story, on the other side. But anyway.
I bet Lazarus had a real problem with that then.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, he had to get extra. I mean, not only if he touched it, he was the dead. And that's right. But anyway, so what they would do, and this is just fascinating to me. About a month before Passover, the road crew would go out. Well, you and I would call it a road crew, the Jewish version of a road crew. They'd go out, and all the graveside tombs, roadside graves, would be whitewashed, so people would not accidentally touch them. Remember what Jesus said to the Pharisees? You're nothing more than whitewashed tombs. You have dead men's bones within you. You're defiled. You may look good on the outside, but you're defiled on the inside. That's what he's referring to. They whitewashed all these tombs so that anybody coming into town would know where they were and could avoid touching them. If they missed one, then, so everybody that came in would go through this ritual cleansing. They had to be ceremonial, they had to be ritually cleansed before participating in the Passover. This purification rod is actually found in Numbers 19, and you've probably heard about the red heifer, the ashes of the red heifer. That's this whole scenario of being dipped in this water with the ashes of the red heifer. It had to be living water, which of course meant it was moving water. It couldn't be from something still. It had to be from a spring or something where the water was moving. The pool of Siloam was used most often in Jerusalem for this. Remember where the blind man went to wash, because it was moving water. But if you did that, let me back up. They could do this in other places besides Jerusalem. This ceremonial cleansing did not have to take place in Jerusalem, because in local synagogues they would keep, I hate to say it, supplies, I guess, or a box or something of these ashes, and they could do it in their local synagogue or their local area. But you got to think that if you're going to travel a distance, you might do something along the way to become unclean, so you might as well just wait till you get there anyway. Why take that chance? And so most of them just came a week early to do that. So that's why they're all there. But that doesn't take that long to do. I was trying to think. I taught on that once, but it only takes a few days, I think, if I remember correctly. The ritual, the procedure that you go through, I don't think it takes a whole week. But anyway, there are a lot of people there, and they're there for this week ahead of time. So what do people do when they're gathered together ahead of time at some place? You stand around and talk. Of course you do. They catch up on current events. They gossip. Look at verse 56. Therefore, they were seeking Jesus. What do you think? They reckon he'll come? They were saying to one another as they stood in the temple, what do you think? Will he not come to the feast at all? And this is said in the negative tense. You don't think he's going to come, do you? What do you think? I don't know. What do you think? Most of the people that came early for this would have come from a distance, and they likely hadn't seen Jesus since the Feast of Tabernacles. Remember, that was the last time that they had to be there. So many of them hadn't seen him since then. Maybe some of them hoped he'd come. Maybe some of them hoped he wouldn't come. Maybe some of them enjoyed seeing a religious leader squirm just a little bit when they encountered someone who'd stand up to them. hey, I'm just standing back and watching the show. But at any rate, they were looking. Is he coming? Is he not? And now look at what verse 57 says. Now the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was, he should report it, that they might seize him. In other words, they were circulating wanted posters. Maybe I've seen too many Westerns lately, but at any rate, the word was out. They wanted to seize him. As King James says, they wanted to capture him. What's your say, Elaine? 57.
They could arrest him.
So that they could arrest him. The bottom line was they wanted to seize him. They wanted to lay hands on him. And we can see from this that someone wanted to seize Jesus. Some of them wanted to seize Jesus even during the Feast of Passover. They were afraid maybe that if they let him slip through their fingers this time, it might be too late to stop him. Maybe the people didn't know that they wanted to kill him, but they just wanted to arrest him. They just wanted to seize him. The people at large may have not known the rest of the story. They may have not known the plan. We don't know. But as we'll see in next week's lesson, there were others who were afraid of arresting him during the feast. I mean, that's what I've always heard. They didn't want to arrest him during the Passover because it might cause a revolt. But we see right here that there were many who did want to arrest him during the Passover because they were afraid if they didn't and he left again, it might be too late to stop him. We'll also see next time that not only did they want to kill Jesus, they wanted to kill Lazarus too. A living Lazarus was an undeniable evidence that Jesus was who he said he was. And so they want to take them both out. So I asked the question of how this was different from chapter 7, verse 32. In 7:32, we saw that the chief priests and Pharisees sent out the temple guard to arrest Jesus. But this time, who do they elicit the help from?
The people.
The people. Think about how that's different. Did you read John 16, verse 2? John 16, verse 2 says, of course, Jesus is speaking to the disciples. This is on the way to the Garden of Gethsemane after the Last Supper. Jesus is speaking to the disciples, just the 11. And he says to them, verse 1, "These things I have spoken to you that you may be kept from stumbling." They, meaning the Romans and the Jews, they will make you outcast, particularly the Jews. They will make you outcast from the synagogue. You disciples, they will make you outcast from the synagogue. But an hour is coming for everyone who kills you to think that he is offering service to God. Did that happen? What did Saul do? Did Saul think he was giving service to God by killing these people? And make no mistake, Saul participated. He says he participated in the murder. And we've often talked about, when he laid down at night and closed his eyes, did he see faces? But he thought he was doing the right thing. It happened with Saul, but it has also happened throughout history. Think of the number of times that the Jews have been persecuted because people were saying, well, they killed Jesus. Christians killed Jews because they said they killed Jesus. They thought they were doing it for God. And it's happening today. We think our political climate is crazy. Have you listened to what's coming out of the mouths of so-called Christians today? If you are strictly a Bible-believing, every word of it's true Christian, then you're on the least ridiculed, and at the worst, you may be considered a threat. The chief priests and the Pharisees, the established leaders of Israel under Rome, actually encouraged the people to turn Jesus in. They gave orders that if anyone knew where he was, he should report it, that they might arrest him. Later, the Romans would encourage people to turn the Christians in. And here we are today. Are we getting to that point again? Who knows? But in our next lesson, we will see what takes place. Everybody knows what happens on Palm Sunday. But because this is real, it's a real historical event, because there is a Palm Sunday, there is a night before. And so our next lesson will be what takes place the night before Palm Sunday. So, any comments or questions?
They seem to think they didn't know what to do with what they knew.
Yeah.
And when you don't know what to do with what you know, you just make it go away.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like that now. People don't know what to do with what they've learned, so they don't stand up for it.
Yep. That's very true. And I guess, one of the things that we really want to do in studying the way we study is not just learn it for the sake of having all the knowledge, of knowing all the details, knowing how all the story fits together. As exciting as that is, and it's very exciting for me to learn how it all fits together. But we have to ask ourselves, what am I going to do with what I know?
To kill Jesus was so extreme. They could have took him somewhere and made him disappear. I mean, things could have been handled differently.
You would think. But again, it goes back to, I believe at least Caiaphas, I believe he knew exactly who he was. Well, how crazy can you be to think you're going to kill the Messiah? Well, how crazy did Satan think he was going to be to overthrow God? Yeah.
Mine says, how can you be so stupid?
That's that's just a pretty good way of putting it.
That's just as blunt as it gets.
Yeah.
How could you be so stupid?
How could you be so stupid?
How can we be so stupid?
Yeah.
In our day and time, how can we be so stupid?
Exactly. Anything else?
He had to die.
Oh yeah, he had to die.
It was, but the way of it is the part that...
He had to die, and he had to die by crucifixion.
Yes.
But, Jesus will say, and I forget the chapter and verse, but he will say, the Son of Man goes forth, meaning to die, but then he will say, but woe to the one by whom it comes. And I remember being a kid and asking a pastor once, well, what if Judas hadn't done it? What if Judas said, no, I don't believe I'm going to do that? Someone else would have done it, just like Esther. Mordecai said to Esther, if you don't speak up, if you don't rise up now, someone else will. But who knows but that you've come to the kingdom for such time as this. Of course, that's on a positive note, and this is on a negative note. It was going to come by someone. And, John has told us all the way through. Now, this was the Judas who did this, and this was he was the one, we've known it. John has made sure that we knew it.
I guess by the way that it did come about, it revealed so much that was going on.
Well, you think about as the disciples are sitting there at that Last Supper meal, and Jesus says, one of you will betray me, and every single one of them says, it's not me, is it? And the tense of that is a question. It's not a statement, it's not me. No, it's not me, is it? Because every single one of them knew what was in their own heart. You and I know what's in our own hearts. Nobody else knows. Only I know how rotten I really am inside. But grace. That's all I can say, but grace. Thank God for grace. Exactly. Anything else? Okay, I guess that'll do it tonight. Okay, I told you.